We began reading from the 6th chapter of John's Gospel 3 Sundays ago. We began with the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness. The next week, we reflected that this food was like the manna that the Israelites were fed in the wilderness. But after the manna ceased, the new manna was the 10 Commandments, the law of God, the very Word of God. And John led us into reflection that Jesus is a new manna, the new Word of God, the new command of God. Last week, Jesus said, "I am the living bread come down from heaven." This bread, we reflected, is like God's physical embrace. This is food for us on our journey back to God. But today, we take this image and make it even more concrete. The living bread that has come down from heaven is food and flesh for the life of the world. This is food for us, meant to be eaten and shared. We are invited to taste and see the goodness of the Lord. In the book of Proverbs, we hear that wisdom has prepared her banquet. Her table is set, and she cries out, "Come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine I have mixed." In the wisdom tradition, wisdom is personified as a woman. And so it's in this likeness to a woman that we might find a way to understand Jesus' words. Just as a mother gives her very flesh and blood to nurture a new life carried within her, and then continues to feed the child from her own body after it is born, so Jesus nourishes with his very self all who are birthed to new life through him. Similar to the union of mother and child while the infant dwells in the womb, Jesus promises, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." At the Last Supper, as Jesus prepared his disciples for his coming passion, he likened it to a woman in the pangs of labor. The death of his earthly body is the birth of new life for all. And John the Evangelist makes this birth even more explicit. It's only John who tells us that after Jesus died on the cross, the soldiers came and pierced Jesus' side with a lance, and at once blood and water flowed out. This is a birthing metaphor. Just as God took one of Adam's ribs from his side and from the rib fashioned it into woman, so Jesus is the new Adam giving birth from his side. On the cross, Jesus gives life to the world. What John wants us to hear is that Jesus is restoring the world, restoring creation to its original blessing. Because after all, our trouble began with a bad meal. We ate the forbidden fruit, trying to seize at godliness on our own terms. So now our salvation comes through this new meal. God is offering us his life as a free gift. In the Gospel of Luke, this is foreshadowed when Mary laid the Christ child in the manger. Jesus had come to be food for a hungry world. When we read the Gospel on Christmas Eve, it begins by reminding us about the emperor, Caesar Augustus. And Luke wants us to understand the contrast here because the emperor, he's the best fed in the ancient world. So like Adam and Eve, he exists to be fed. But Jesus exists to be fed upon. Jesus gives his flesh and blood. This is his whole self, his whole being. And we eat the bread. So it's not only the food, but the act of eating itself, which has meaning for us. You take this kingdom into you. You chew it. You make it part of yourself. You incorporate it, digest it, and you are nourished by it. You become a different kind of being. We become what we eat. Bread is perhaps our primary symbol for food, health, nourishment, and community. Father Ron Rollheiser reflects on the image of bread and wine. Bread, he says, is a symbol for life and people coming together. But there's another story to bread. The kernels of wheat had to be crushed. They had to let go of their individuality in order to be ground and become a communal thing, to become flour, which then had to endure fire to be baked into the substance that gives off that smell of life, the smell of fresh bread. So bread speaks of both joy and pain. Wine, too, speaks in this double way. On the one hand, it's a festive drink, perhaps our foremost symbol for celebration. Wine has nothing to do with basic nourishment or necessity. Wine speaks of friendship, community, celebration, joy, recreation. But like bread, wine has another side. Individual grapes are crushed, and their very blood becomes the substance out of which ferments this warm, festive drink. Bread. Individual grains ground into flour and baked into bread. Clusters of grapes are crushed, and the juice is fermented into wine. Bread and wine, flesh and blood, the sacramental sign of the Eucharist. Jesus gives us his whole self, flesh and blood. So the Eucharist is the real presence of Christ. In the Eucharist, Father Michael Himes says, we find Jesus of Nazareth. And in Jesus, we find God made flesh. Father Himes invites us, though, to consider the Eucharist. If we think about it, especially this week, what we're invited to do is to remember that the Eucharist is something that is eaten so that people have life, something that we drink so that people are refreshed. This symbolic act recalls a great Christian insight. For if you seek to know who God is, look at Jesus of Nazareth. And if you seek to know who Jesus is, he is the one who is eaten so that we may be nourished. So the Eucharist then is the great acting out of who Jesus and God is, the one who gives himself away fully and without reserve. So if you wish to find God, give yourself away. When we do Eucharist, we enact what we mean by the word God.